This is the third part of learning and memory. And I'm going to talk briefly about the changing views of consolidation. So consolidation being this laying down of new memory, that when it is actually laid down in some form, that it is consolidated. Well, that in itself has changed the way we talk about it. And the way we talk about long-term memory, it has certainly changed. So some long-term memories are not consolidated. You will probably not remember the words from the beginning of that serial position curve tomorrow, next week, and certainly not for the rest of your life. And thank goodness, right? So I did the 5 words, which I don't even remember now. I think I do actually, because I used a bunch of the same words of dog, purple, elephant, my 3 usual words, and I used desk and canoe. Those weren't the order, but you probably didn't remember those now. You may have remembered one of those or something about them. As I'm going to come back to elephants again, and as if you've been in a class with me before, I've used dog before, and maybe elephant too. But thank goodness, because if we remembered, because we got those into long-term memory, according to that research, looking at the serial position curve, just because I remembered those words and we're saying they were in long-term memory, if we remembered everything like that for the rest of our lives, our memories would be this just clutter of really unimportant information. So thank goodness that we won't remember those words tomorrow, next week, and certainly not for the rest of our lives. And as I just said, the idea about consolidation was that protein synthesis had to occur and that this took time and it helped to sleep and all of that. But another example of why we need to change our views of consolidation and what this means and how it happens is because emotional events or traumatic events, they don't take us time and energy to remember. He talks a little bit here about flashbulb memories, but whether we are in a traumatic event or we are learning some really emotionally laden kind of news, we have different areas, different neurotransmitters, neurochemicals being released, and it looks like memory, this kind of consolidation occurs in a really different way. So if we are in the middle of a traumatic event, we have cortisol and epinephrine are released, and this stimulate the amygdala and the hippocampus. And really what's going on with the amygdala appears to be really different. Now, we have talked about the amygdala for emotional processing, and I kept shutting in there. Don't forget classical conditioning. Don't forget classical conditioning. That kind of learning appears to be really different. And we also see a real stimulation of the hippocampus as well. And remember, those are tightly connected structures there with this release of cortisol and epinephrine. We also see norepinephrine being released throughout the cortex. That, if you remember, the norepinephrine is going to increase my arousal and my attention, so my ability to remember, and release that causes a release of dopamine in the hippocampus. So again, allowing for the consolidation of memory. And so this is happening without me taking the time to remember and without that same kind of consolidation as we've talked about it before, but this is still memory consolidation. So basically, consolidation may be fast, it might be slow, and is not clearly dependent on the time it takes to synthesize some new proteins. Also, a consolidated memory is not as solid as we once assumed it to be. I have sometimes in several classes, I say things like, well, every time we bring up a memory and talk about it, so I bring up this 5th grade skating party relatively often because it's my example, my one birthday party that I really remember. But so every time I bring that up, that memory is in an awakened memory, like that is in a labile state, and it's going to be reconsolidated. So when I bring it up and talk about it, I am biologically changing that memory, and that is again requiring protein synthesis. So if you think back to that Atkinson and Shiffrin model of sensory memory, if we pay attention to something, it gets into short-term memory, and that is having encoding and retrieval, these interactions with long-term memory. That short-term memory was what was originally proposed, and the idea behind it was that it was this just short-term storage of input of ideas. In order to keep something in short-term memory or to recall it, we need to rehearse it. So some of the control processes that we saw as influencing short-term memory are rehearsal, the decoding and encoding into long-term memory, decision processes, so what to output, and then or how to use things a bit, and then the retrieval strategies, how do I retrieve things from long-term memory. The point of short-term memory was that it was short, and it was easy to say this 7 plus or minus 2 and then talk about, well, the complications are in really the control processes, where again, even the 7 plus or minus 2 has been updated to, they think it's more like 4 plus or minus 1, given a certain material, and if there's absolutely no ability to chunk information together. Anyway, they needed to update short-term memory, and they updated it to what they call working memory. This was done by Badley and Hitch in the 70s, and working memory made it really clear that this was more of a mental workbench, and that what's happening in that working memory is a conscious mental effort, not just a storage unit that has some processes influencing it. So my example here is processing a sentence. I'm going to start rambling through this sentence where you're not really sure how it's going to end, and you are retrieving information from long-term memory. All of these words that are in your mental lexicon are being put together, and they are being actively integrated into some representation that you are constantly building upon as I try to finish up the sentence, so that when I finish the sentence by saying elephant, you have to figure out how that fits into your representation. That is a really active process. You can also think of math, that where there's any kind of like a 285 plus 469, you have to hold things in memory. You have to carry the 1. I don't know how people do math anymore, but I have to carry the 1. You have to hold that in memory. That might be updated. Things have to be integrated, and it's constantly changing, which is changing what is in the short-term memory, or in this case, really what's in the working memory, and clearly it's active. If we look at the brain regions that are involved when we are using this working memory, clearly we are using the prefrontal cortex. That is where I showed before the difference between, I think it was KF, and where that damage occurred. But we also see activity in the parietal lobes as well. If you think about what's going to happen in a lot of these tasks is some kind of motor response. This could very well be what is my intention to move. If you remember, the parietal lobes are giving me my intention to move, and what they are seeing are these gamma oscillations. First of all, there isn't some particular neuron or particular small region that's active. What's happening is there is a change in activity across several neurons, and these gamma oscillations are very quick. High frequency brain waves on the EEG up to about 100 hertz, and so very quick communications between various neurons. And this isn't happening in some particular neuron or a couple of neurons. This is changing across time, these gamma oscillations, in response to whatever our motor response is going to be. So I have taught cognitive, and I have taught learning and memory, and I really enjoy talking about memory, and I always end up talking about it way too long in my classes. I'm trying to shorten this a bit, but so we just talked about short-term memory. I'm not going to include sensory memory under that, but this picture does. But we really want to distinguish our components, and remember, we've seen double dissociation between short-term memory and long-term memory. These are served by different mechanisms in the brain, and they are truly independent of each other. Well, long-term memory is a very complicated memory store that includes a lot of different kinds of information. It includes declarative memory or explicit memory. So what we're going to see as that work that's being done by the hippocampus, the events in my life, what we call episodic memory, you might think of them as episodes of your life. my autobiographical memory, and when I'm talking about that 5th grade skating party, that is a particular episodic memory. It also includes the facts that I remember. So my semantic memory, my world knowledge, my knowledge about objects, my knowledge about language, and I don't like conceptual priming being in there because priming seems like non-declarative memory, but the fact that our semantic memory influences that priming is certainly true. So our semantic memory is devoid a great deal of context. I don't remember where I learned that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. That fact has just lived on after probably many times learning that and hearing that. So semantic memory. And we distinguish declarative memory, that kind of explicit memory that we can declare, we can say out loud what we know, from non-declarative memory or implicit memory. And I have already been talking about some of this already. I've talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and that operant conditioning includes classical conditioning so that we're learning those associations. We also have non-associative learning that I'm going to talk a bit about at the end when I talk about actually what's changing in the cells themselves as we are learning. As we can see most simply with habituation and sensitization, so that really non-associative learning. We have the procedural memory that I've talked about before as skills, but they are not just muscle memory or motor skills, but also cognitive skills. And we're going to keep coming back to that. And then we also have our perceptual representation system where we have perceptual priming. We have conceptual priming as well, which, like I said, it is influenced by declarative memory, but that kind of the priming, the fact that I've seen this before, heard this before, and so I can recognize it more quickly, that kind of priming is an implicit kind of memory. It's a really good idea if you have not already had a lot of background or exposure to those different components of memory to go ahead and write down or draw some of that diagram for yourself, mostly the long-term memory and really the distinction between declarative or explicit memory and then non-declarative or implicit memory, because I'm going to keep referring to those as if you know them, and if you don't, then you really want something to look at to refer to. But a lot of people have come in probably with some background in that. So I'm going to start with the hippocampus and talk about that for a little while. People with damage to the hippocampus suffer severe anterograde amnesia with some retrograde amnesia. And the anterograde is it's harder for me to lay down new memories, and so I'm losing the memory that occurs after the injury or surgery or whatever happens. If you think of I don't know how much any of this helps people, but the antebellum South was the period of the South that was after slavery was abolished. So there's that after, antero is kind of anti is being used there. And then the retrograde amnesia is a loss of memories from before the injury or surgery or whatever happened, the trauma to the brain. And retro, you can think oh, that's so retro. So going back in the past, if that helps anybody. And what we see when we have damage to the hippocampus is there is loss of new memories. They're not laying down new memories, so they have anterograde amnesia. The picture's a little bit misleading in my mind, but I use it because I like the way they show the graded amnesia. So what's lost actually there is being shown with the retrograde amnesia with the lines. So I've lost mostly what is most recent or what was closest to whatever injury, surgery, trauma to the brain. I mentioned concussions before that usually they lose that day, and especially whatever happened just before, especially anything they hadn't slept on because it hadn't been consolidated. But with amnesia, we can see this going a little bit more back in the past in this kind of graded fashion. And I think he does talk about HM and how we learned from him how much retrograde amnesia there really can be. But if you think about every time I bring up that 5th grade birthday party, and I lay it back down, so I'm reconsolidating it. When HM is bringing up these stories from his past and talking about them, they're not getting laid back down in that same way. And so we see this kind of slow loss of what happened from what happened before the injury as well. And I'm going to put this link down there, this YouTube video of a patient talking about his damage to his hippocampus and the anterograde amnesia. I'm sorry, and that little bit of graded amnesia that he had, and he comes back from it. It's a good description of all of this, as well as talking about the brain regions and what happened to him and what can happen. So in the last slide presentation, it ended with the Australian man who was talking about his own experience with temporary hippocampal damage. And I'm going to shorten a lot of this as much as I can, and it's not going to seem that way because when I'm going to ask what's the hippocampus doing for us, it's doing a great deal. A lot of what we know of what the hippocampus is doing for us is from the patient HM. And if you've had any kind of background in memory, if you've taken any class where they've talked about memory, they've probably talked about HM. He is a patient, or was a patient, who had not just his hippocampi, so on both sides, removed, but some of the nearby structures of the medial temporal lobes were also removed. And the pictures at the very bottom are showing various slices that show the area of his brain that is missing now, or that was taken out. And he's probably more famous than most of the memory researchers, as they did a great deal of research on him. You can consider him one of probably the best known case studies in the history of memory, as he lived with this hippocampal damage for decades, and so we could see the long-term effects of damage to the hippocampus. What we saw as the symptomology in HM is what we see with hippocampal damage in general. So he had impaired long-term memory, but his short-term memory, working memory, remained intact. And I used this example last time of him remembering the number 584 for 15 minutes as he went through this strategy and kept it in his short-term memory, explained the strategy, remembered the number, and then as soon as someone distracted him, forgot the number, forgot the strategy, forgot everything. So as long as he was keeping something, rehearsing something and keeping it in short-term memory, he was fine. He had a few weak semantic memories. Really, semantic memories are built up over episodic memories to a great degree, but he had some weak semantic memories from information that was encountered more recently, or information that was encountered after the surgery. So people who had come around after his surgery in I want to say it was in the late 50s, if he was given Elvis or the name Martin Luther as first names, he would say Presley for Elvis and King for Martin Luther as last names, which suggests that he had some semantic memory. I do want to say that to some extent, that finishing, hearing Elvis and saying Presley has some amount of implicit memory to it, but it's showing a semantic memory. He had severe impairment of his episodic memory, so he can describe facts from before the surgery, but is not good with personal memories. So with the anterograde amnesia, he was not laying down any new episodic memories, and he could see the same doctors and researchers and do the same tasks and not remember ever having that autobiographical experience. And if you remember what the Australian man said, and so part of what we're going to see with the hippocampal damage is some graded retrograde amnesia as well. And so if we look from before the surgery, he had facts from before, he had what he had learned from before the surgery, but was not so good with the personal memories from before the surgery, and especially as you get closer to the surgery. He had better implicit memory than explicit memory, so he was still able to be conditioned. There's an example of him sitting in a particular chair and having the
Lecture30a, the aversive eye blink conditioning, and he would immediately react as if he was conditioned. They would have him sit down in the chair to do the task. He would have no idea what he was doing there. He would have no memory of doing that task, but he was classically conditioned nonetheless, as the amygdala and the cerebellum were still working, and he had intact procedural memory. So he was able to, one of the tasks they use sometimes for this is the mirror drawing task, where you look at a picture and it's in a mirror, and you're tracing the picture from looking in the mirror. And if you ever just go ahead and try and do something in a mirror a little bit, at first it's really hard because everything's opposite, goes the opposite way of what you expect, but it gets easier and easier. And again, doesn't remember doing the task before, but sits down and does it surprisingly well for himself because he doesn't remember doing it before, but that procedural memory is intact. And in fact, if I remember correctly, he got some kind of not a factory job, but maybe a factory job. It was where you're doing the same task over and over again repeatedly in his job, and that he was able to learn because it was procedural memory. I repeat here what I've just said really, but this is the nice kind of summarized synthesis from the book of people with this type of amnesia or hippocampal damage show this pattern, which you can read. So if we look at the theories of the function of the hippocampus, this hippocampus is helping us with all of these things, but the first one is that the hippocampus is necessary for declarative memory, especially episodic memory. And they've looked at this by looking at non-humans doing these either a delayed matching to sample task or the delayed non-matching to sample task, where the monkey in this case is given the sample. We're going to show a delayed non-matching to sample task, and the sample in this case is the triangle, and so that's the object they need to remember. And then they also need to remember that this is, as they're learning the task, that this is a non-matching to sample task. They have to remember that this is the task that they are performing in this case. And so in this case, they're going to go look for the food under the new object, and the monkey's going to know that the food is under the circle because it's not matching the triangle. And with hippocampal damage, we see that this is a very difficult task for animals to do. We also see this with prefrontal cortex damage, as there is some working memory in this, but there's declarative episodic memory in this as well, as I'm remembering both my task and what the sample was. The hippocampus is necessary for spatial memory. I got this a lot on the first exam of just it helps us with navigation. And my example before was the research done with London taxi drivers. So remember, they need to know London well enough to be able to answer questions like, how do you get from tourist area A to tourist area B, regardless of what those are in this huge city. And then they also take this simulated driving task test where they are shown that certain routes have construction and they have to find a different way around. They have to really know London. And we see that London taxi drivers have larger parahippocampal place areas, so this area around the hippocampus, than non-taxi drivers, and then larger hippocampi, larger areas than London bus drivers, as taxi drivers are constantly learning the navigation of this very large and busy and changing city. And the longer they're taxi drivers, the larger that parahippocampal place area. We also see they've looked at rats in these radial mazes where if we have something like, let's say some of these floorings are have a light down them or have carpet on them. I'll use carpet. Have carpet on them. The rats with hippocampal damage can learn that as if they have food under just some of the radia off of there, if they have food in some of those and food is never on the carpeting, the rats will learn to avoid the carpeting but the rats do not learn to avoid looking in places where they've already looked. So if they've already looked and they've gotten food, or there is no food, they don't need to look back down that radial, that part of that arm of the maze. And yet they'll keep looking down the same arms of the maze that they've looked down before, because they're not creating that memory for their spatial orientation. The final theory of the function to the hippocampus, and I'm saying the hippocampus really helps us to do all of these things, is how these theories came along, and how they fit together is really the question. So the hippocampus helps us to remember the details of context. If we think back to those older memories, remembering those memories, bringing those up, like me talking about my 5th grade birthday party, that involves the hippocampus less than me talking about something that happened a couple of weeks ago. As we get into the older learning, or things that are older and back farther in our past, they really have less context. So the more consolidated a memory becomes, the less it depends on the hippocampus.